The desert wind carried the smell of gun oil and burnt coffee through the narrow corridors of forward operating Base Kestrel, a concrete and sandbag installation sitting like a scar on the Syrian-Iraqi border. Most soldiers who served there called it the edge of the world. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez called it home. She had been awake for 31 hours. That wasn't unusual for her. Sleep, in Elena's experience, was something that happened to other people, people who hadn't spent the last 6 years piecing together intelligence fragments like broken glass, trying to see the full picture before someone bled for the missing pieces. She sat alone in the dimly lit analysis room, 4 monitors glowing in front of her, red string connecting printed photographs across a corkboard that covered an entire wall. Her dark hair was pulled back tight. A cold cup of coffee sat forgotten at her elbow. Elena Vasquez was 29 years old, born in San Antonio, Texas, to a Mexican-American father who fixed cars and a mother who taught elementary school. She had enlisted at 18 not out of desperation, but out of a burning, almost stubborn desire to matter, to do something real in a world that kept telling young women from working-class neighborhoods that the ceiling was lower for them. The Army didn't lower the ceiling. It blew the roof off entirely. By 23, she had earned her intelligence specialist designation. By 26, she had 2 commendations and a reputation that made senior officers either deeply grateful or deeply uncomfortable, depending on which side of a briefing table they sat on. She was fluent in Arabic, Farsi, and Kurdish. She could read a satellite image the way a musician reads sheet music, instinctively, completely, hearing things no one else heard. And right now, what she was hearing terrified her. The intelligence file on her desk concerned a man the region's locals called simply Al-Qaeda, the commander. His real name was Tariq Hassani, a former Iraqi military strategist who had disappeared from official records in 2017 and reappeared like a ghost 3 years later, leading a brutal paramilitary force that operated in the shadows between borders. He was not a fanatic. He was not chaotic. That was what made him so dangerous. Tariq Hassani was disciplined, methodical, and completely without mercy. He didn't massacre villages out of rage. He did it out of strategy, to silence resistance, to spread fear, to make entire populations too broken to fight back. Elena had been tracking him for 4 months. What she had found in the last 48 hours had turned her blood cold. 3 separate intercepted communications, 2 unusual vehicle convoys moving northwest toward the Khyber River Valley, an informant signal, faint, irregular, possibly compromised, that had pulsed twice in a code pattern she recognized. When she overlaid the convoy routes with population maps and cross-referenced Hassani's previous attack patterns, a single location emerged with terrifying clarity. The village of Tal Safra, population 412, mostly farmers, elderly residents, women, children, a community that had, 3 months earlier, publicly refused to pay tribute to Hassani's forces, a community that had, in doing so, signed its own death warrant in his eyes. The timeline Elena calculated gave them 72 hours, maybe less. At 800 hours, she walked into Colonel Marcus Hale's briefing room with a 12-page analysis, 3 supporting maps, and the kind of quiet certainty in her eyes that should have made every person in that room sit up straight. Colonel Hale was 51, broad-shouldered, with a silver crew cut and the permanent squint of a man who had spent decades looking at things he wished he hadn't seen. He was not a cruel man. He was not unintelligent. But he was tired, overextended, and operating under pressure from command structures above him that demanded restraint, caution, and the avoidance of what they called intelligence overreach. Elena laid her findings on the table. She walked them through every data point, every pattern, every convergence of evidence that pointed to one conclusion. She spoke clearly, without drama, letting the facts carry their own weight. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Colonel Hale leaned back in his chair and said the words that would echo in Elena's chest for days afterward. "It's speculative, Vasquez. We're not redirecting assets based on pattern analysis and a ghost signal. She pushed back, professionally, firmly, with every tool available to her. She cited precedent. She cited the informant's previous reliability. She cited the body count from Hassani's last 3 operations, which had followed identical preparatory patterns to what she was describing now. Hale acknowledged the work. He did not change his decision. Alina walked out of that briefing room with her folder under her arm, and a feeling she had learned to trust more than any piece of equipment she carried. The feeling that the clock was already running, that somewhere out in the desert, 400 people were going about their ordinary lives completely unaware that a machine of violence was turning in their direction, and that the only person who fully understood that right now was her. She returned to her analysis room. She sat down. She stared at the corkboard. Outside, the desert wind picked up, pushing sand against the windows like a whisper, like a warning. She was not done. Not even close. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists only inside institutions, the loneliness of being right when everyone around you has decided, for reasons of procedure and politics and exhaustion, that you are wrong. Staff Sergeant Alina Vasquez had felt that loneliness before. She had never let it stop her, but she had also never felt it this sharp, this urgent, this loud. She spent the hours after the briefing doing what she always did when command closed a door. She went back to the data. She pulled every intercept from the last 72 hours and rebuilt her timeline from scratch, looking for errors, looking for the cracks in her own reasoning, genuinely hopping to find something that would tell her she was wrong, that the people of Tal Safra were safe, that she could stand down. She found nothing that weakened her case. She found 3 more things that strengthened it. A fuel requisition pattern from a black market supplier the U.S. had been monitoring for 2 years. Unusual. Quantities consistent with a large vehicle convoy preparing for a long-distance operation. Second, a Kurdish shepherd in the Valley region had reported to a local NGO worker that armed men had been moving through the Eastern Ridge roads after dark for the past 4 nights. The NGO worker had flagged it in a humanitarian report that most military analysts would never read. Alina read everything. Third, one of Hassani's known field lieutenants, a man called Barzan, had not made his regular check-in with a monitored communication channel in 36 hours. That kind of silence, in Alina's experience, did not mean inactivity. It meant operational lockdown. It meant the mission had begun. She compiled everything into a supplemental report and took it to the one person on the base she trusted absolutely. Sergeant First Class Daniel Akafer was 34 years old, built like a defensive lineman, and possessed of a mind that was simultaneously tactical and deeply humane. He had grown up in Lagos, Nigeria, moved to the United States at 16, and enlisted the day after his 21st birthday out of a conviction, as he often said, that freedom was not abstract. It was something people had to stand in front of and protect with their bodies. He and Alina had served together for 3 years. They had never needed to explain themselves to each other. They had simply, from the beginning, understood one another. Daniel read her supplemental report in 11 minutes. He looked up. "You're right," he said, not a question, a statement. "I know," she said. "Hale won't move without authorization from above, and above won't authorize without more concrete evidence than this." "I know that too." Daniel leaned forward. "So what do we do?" Alina slid a second sheet of paper across the desk. It was a formal request, drafted, formatted, regulation perfect, asking for a small reconnaissance team, 2 vehicles, and a UAV surveillance window over the Khyber Valley for a period of 6 hours. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that required significant resource commitment. Just enough to confirm or deny her assessment with eyes on the ground and in the sky. Daniel read it. He nodded slowly. "I'll take this up myself, add my name to it." They went to Colonel Hale together. The meeting was short. Hale read the request, asked 3 questions, and denied it. The official reason was resource allocation. The unofficial reason, the one Alina read in the space between his words, was that approving it would mean admitting the first briefing had been handled wrong, and in a command structure already under scrutiny, that was a risk Hale was not willing to take. They walked out into the corridor. The base hummed around them, generators, radio chatter, the distant sound of a helicopter on approach. Normal sounds. The sounds of a world that didn't yet know what was coming. Daniel put his hand briefly on Alina's shoulder. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said quietly. "Just be ready." She didn't explain what she meant. Not then. That night at 23:40 hours, Alina was alone in the analysis room when the encrypted radio on her secondary channel pulsed 3 times, paused, then pulsed twice more. Her spine went rigid. She knew that code. Amara. The informant's name was Amara Khalil, 26 years old, a schoolteacher's daughter from a village 30 kilometers north of Tal Safra who had, 18 months ago, approached a U.S. field contact with information about Hassani's operations at extraordinary personal risk. She had been feeding intelligence ever since, carefully, sporadically, always through coded signals that minimized her exposure. Alina had never met her in person. But she had built a picture of Amara through her transmissions, a woman of extraordinary courage operating in impossible conditions, surrounded by danger every single hour of every single day. The signal tonight was different from anything Amara had sent before. It was fragmented, compressed, clearly transmitted under duress. Alina spent 40 minutes carefully decoding it. When she finished, she sat very still for a long moment. The massacre was not 72 hours away. It was 36, maybe less. Hassani had accelerated his timeline. The convoy was already moving, and Amara, alone, terrified and still impossibly brave, was still inside the camp. Alina looked at the decoded message one more time. Then she looked at the wall, at the photographs, at the red string connecting everything to one small village on a map that most of the world would never find. She thought about 412 people going to sleep tonight not knowing. She thought about the briefing, about the denial, about procedure and authorization and resource allocation. Then she opened her locker and began to pack. At 3:40 hours, Fob Kestrel was as quiet as it ever got, which was not quiet at all, but quiet enough. The generators still hummed. The perimeter guards still walked their rotations. The night shift radio operator still sat half awake over his equipment. But the corridors were empty, the mess hall was dark, and the particular brand of institutional attention that made individual movement visible had, for a few hours, relaxed its grip. Alina moved through those corridors like water, not rushing, not hesitating, just flowing through the spaces where no one was looking. She had always been good at that. Not because she was small, though she was lean and moved economically, but because she understood on some deep and practical level how attention worked, where it gathered, where it didn't, how to exist in the margins of a system without triggering its reflexes. She carried only what she could fit in a low-profile pack and on her body, her M17 sidearm with 4 loaded magazines, her combat knife strapped to her thigh, a compact encrypted radio with a hand-crank emergency charging function, water purification tablets, a 3-day supply of caloric rations, a field medical kit, night vision monocular. And folded inside her left breast pocket, close to her heart almost without her realizing it, the decoded message from Amara and her hand-drawn map of Hassani's camp perimeter, built from 4 months of surveillance data. She left one thing behind, a single sheet of paper sealed in an envelope addressed to Daniel Akafer, placed inside his personal mail slot at the base communications board. She did not write an explanation. She wrote coordinates, a timeline, and 3 words at the bottom. Trust the data. Then she walked out of Fob Kestrel through a drainage culvert on the eastern perimeter that the base engineers had flagged for maintenance 6 weeks ago and never fixed, and she disappeared into the desert. The desert at night on the Syrian-Iraqi border is not the desert of postcards and imagination. It is not romantic. It is not silent. It breathes with wind that carries grit into your teeth and eyes and lungs, and it hides the ground's true nature. Landscape riddled with loose rock, sudden drops, irrigation ditches long since abandoned, and in certain areas, the remnants of old conflicts in the form of buried things that still kill a person who stepped wrong. Lena had studied the terrain maps until she could recall them with her eyes closed. She moved carefully, deliberately, using her night vision monocular in short intervals to preserve its battery, navigating primarily by the stars and by the compass bearing she had committed to memory before she left. She moved for 4 hours without stopping. Back at the base, Daniel Akafer woke at 600 for his regular shift, went to the communications board out of habit and found the envelope. He read it once, standing in the corridor in his uniform, completely still. Then he read it again. He looked up at the ceiling for a long moment, jaw tight, processing the specific mix of fear and respect and helpless solidarity that Elena Vasquez had over the years made him feel more than any other person he had ever known. Then he folded the note, put it in his pocket, and went to work, covering her absence with the careful, plausible story of a soldier on an approved solo reconnaissance task. A story he built in real time with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that the lie he was telling was in service of something true. He had perhaps 6 hours before the cover broke. He intended to use every minute. Elena, meanwhile, had reached the first significant obstacle. The road that crossed her path was not on the standard military maps. It had been established in the last several months as a supply route by Hassani's forces. She crouched in a shallow depression 50 meters back and observed it for 23 minutes. 2 vehicles passed, heading northwest, exactly the direction she was going, exactly the direction her coordinates pointed. She noted the vehicle types, the approximate number of occupants, the timing interval between them. She cataloged everything, then crossed the road in the 9-minute window between patrols, low and fast, barely disturbing the dust. On the other side of the road, she found something that stopped her. A village, or what had been a village. She had known intellectually that Hassani's forces had passed through this area. She had read the reports, processed the satellite images, analyzed the casualty estimates. But there is a difference between knowing a thing through data and standing inside it. The burned buildings were not yet cold. The smell of smoke was still thick in the air. Personal objects, a child's sandal, a cooking pot, a prayer rug, lay scattered in the dust with the specific heartbreak of things abandoned in terror. Elena stood among the ruins for exactly 90 seconds. She did not allow herself longer than that. She looked at everything, recorded it in the precise, photographic way her training had developed in her, and then she turned away and kept walking. But something changed in her during those 90 seconds. Some final membrane of hesitation dissolved. She had not been uncertain before, but she had been operating in the space where professional duty and personal conviction overlapped, justifying her choice in the language of intelligence assessment and threat evaluation. After those 90 seconds, she was no longer justifying anything. She was simply moving toward the thing that needed to be stopped, without reservation, without the weight of doubt. The sun came up 3 hours later. She found shelter in a dry riverbed, pulled a thermal blanket over herself against the building heat, and slept for 90 minutes trained, disciplined sleep, the sleep of a soldier who knows that rest is a tactical resource. When she woke, the coordinates on her map told her she was 11 kilometers from Hassani's camp. 11 kilometers from Amara. 11 kilometers from the answer to a question that 400 people didn't even know was being asked about their lives. She drank water, ate a ration bar, checked her radio. Nothing yet from Daniel, which could mean her cover was still holding or could mean the signal was too weak this far out, and stood up. 11 kilometers. She started walking. The camp revealed itself slowly, the way dangerous things often do, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece a little worse than the last. From a ridgeline above the canyon at approximately 1700 hours, Alina lay flat against the rock in the dying afternoon light and studied what was below her through her monocular. It was larger than her intelligence estimates had suggested, significantly larger. The canyon walls provided natural cover and a defensive advantage that explained why Hassani had chosen this location. From the air, at a casual surveillance pass, it looked like empty terrain. You had to be above it and looking directly down to see the full scope of what lived inside. She counted vehicles first. 14. Several were military-grade trucks, the kind that could carry weapons, ammunition, and men in significant quantities. Others were modified civilian vehicles, welded with improvised armor plating, the signature equipment of a force that was well-organized but deliberately non-attributable. She counted personnel, visible personnel, accounting for the roughly 30% that would always be out of sight in any given observation window. Her estimate came to just over 200, armed, structured, moving with the disciplined efficiency of people who knew their roles and had rehearsed their movements. This was not a militia, this was an army. She spent 40 minutes observing from the ridge before she descended. She identified the primary command tent, larger, more central, with a generator and communication equipment visible at its entrance. She identified the weapons storage area, partially concealed under camouflage netting at the northern end of the camp. She identified the vehicle staging area, where 4 of the largest trucks were parked in a formation that suggested they were prepared for rapid deployment. And she identified, near the canyon's eastern wall, a cluster of smaller tents set apart from the main camp, where a small number of individuals moved with a different energy than the soldiers, more restricted, more watchful, more afraid. That was where Amara would be. Getting down from the ridge and into the canyon required 40 minutes of careful navigation through goat paths and loose scree. Alina changed her appearance as she moved, removing her tactical vest and pack, concealing them in a crevice in the rock face with a GPS marker, and using items she had packed specifically for this purpose to alter her silhouette. A local-style abaya, worn and dusty, over her base layer, a head covering. She had done this before, not in this specific camp, but in environments like it, where the margin between accepted and suspicious was razor-thin, and everything depended on moving at the right pace, looking in the right direction, projecting the right level of unremarkable. She entered the camp's periphery through the eastern approach, following a path that several women were using to carry water from a tank near the canyon wall. She fell into the rhythm of the movement. Nobody looked twice. The eastern cluster of tents was exactly what she had assessed from above, a segregated area where locals pressed into service for the camp's logistics were housed. Cooks, water carriers, people who had been conscripted, threatened, or coerced into maintaining the camp's infrastructure. It was, in the brutal economy of Hassani's operation, a population he needed but did not value. Alina found Amara in the third tent. She knew her immediately, not from a photograph, because there were no photographs of Amara in any file Alina had access to, but from something harder to name, a quality of stillness. The way Amara sat in the corner of the tent, mending a piece of cloth with her hands while her eyes moved, cataloging, assessing, measuring everything in the space around her with the trained alertness of someone who had been surviving by observation for a very long time. Their eyes met. Amara's hands did not stop moving. Alina sat down nearby and began adjusting the wrapping on her head covering. To anyone watching, 2 women resting. They spoke in murmurs in Arabic without looking directly at each other, a skill that both of them, in their different experiences, had learned out of necessity. What Amara told her in the next 12 minutes was precise, detailed, and devastating. The convoy would move at 200 hours, 214 men, 11 vehicles. The target was Tal Safra. The orders were direct from Hassani himself, no survivors, no structures left standing. The purpose was to send a message to every other village in the valley that resistance to his authority carried a cost too absolute to consider. He had done this before, and he intended to keep doing it systematically until the entire region's will was broken. But Amara had more. She had memorized the camp layout, the shift rotation schedule, the location of Hassani's personal command position, and the route the convoy would take. She had been collecting this information for 2 weeks, waiting for a signal that someone was coming. Alina listened to all of it, every word. She asked 3 precise clarifying questions. Then she reached into the hidden layer of her abaya and pressed a small folded paper into Amara's hand, a set of coordinates, a time window, and 4 Arabic words that translated to wait for the sound. Amara looked at the paper. Then she looked at Alina, really looked at her, for the first time directly. In her eyes was not gratitude, not yet. What was there was something more complicated than gratitude. The look of a person who has been alone in a dangerous place for a very long time and has just, for the first time, understood that alone does not mean abandoned. Alina looked back, nodded once. Then she stood, adjusted her head covering, picked up an empty water container from the tent's entrance, and walked back into the camp, moving toward the communication area, carrying the weight of everything Amara had told her, and thinking, with the precise, focused clarity of a mind under maximum pressure, about exactly what she was going to do with it. She had the information, she had the layout, she had the timeline. Now she needed to get it out. There is a moment in every crisis, military, personal, moral, when the chaos that has been building in every direction suddenly compresses into a single point of decision. For Alina Vasquez, that moment came at 21:17 hours, crouched behind a generator housing at the northern edge of Hassani's camp, with her encrypted radio pressed against her lips and the sound of armed men moving 40 meters away. She had been working her way toward the communication area for over 2 hours, moving in intervals, using the camp's own noise and activity as cover. The evening meal had created the best window, a period of dispersed attention, men gathered in loose groups, the rhythm of the camp relaxing slightly before the tension of a pre-operation night reasserted itself. She had used those minutes carefully, memorizing patrol patterns, identifying the 2 external communication antennas Hassani's forces used for coordination, and positioning herself near the generator that powered the northern section of the camp. The radio transmission needed to be short, 45 seconds maximum. Anything longer risked detection by the camp's own signal monitoring, which Amara had told her was active but not sophisticated, oriented primarily to catch incoming external signals, not outgoing short-burst transmissions from inside the perimeter. Alina had composed the message in her head during the 4-hour walk to the camp and refined it during every observation hour since. Coordinates of the camp, convoy departure time, route to Tal Safra, personnel and vehicle count. And one additional piece of information she had observed herself during her 2 hours of internal movement: the location of the weapons cache under the camouflage netting, and the single access road into the canyon that any strike force or blocking position would need to control. She transmitted. The signal went out in 41 seconds, compressed and encrypted, bouncing off a relay frequency that Daniel Akafer had the receiver for. Then she closed the radio, pressed herself against the generator housing, and waited to find out whether the world had heard her. 300 kilometers away, in the analysis room of Fob Kestrel, Daniel Akafer's receiver lit up at 21:19 hours. He had been awake for 22 hours. He had spent the last 6 of them managing an increasingly precarious cover story for Alina's absence, while simultaneously monitoring every frequency she might use to make contact, running his own parallel analysis of the threat data she had left behind, and conducting what could charitably be called aggressive advocacy with Colonel Hale's staff for a reassessment of the Tal Safra threat picture. He grabbed the transmission. He decoded it in under 4 minutes. They had agreed on the encoding protocol 2 years earlier, a personal cipher built on a system only the two of them knew. What came out of the decoding was not fragmentary. It was not speculative. It was exact, detailed, time-stamped intelligence with the kind of source reliability that required no qualification. Daniel walked into Colonel Hale's quarters at 21:34 hours without knocking. What followed was not a polished briefing. It was not a formatted presentation with slides and supporting documents. It was Daniel Acaffer standing in a half-lit room, handing a piece of paper to a senior officer and saying with absolute directness, "She's inside the camp, sir. She has confirmation. The convoy moves at 200. Tal Safra doesn't survive until morning unless we move in the next 3 hours." Colonel Hale read the transmission. He read it again. The expression on his face moved through several places: surprise, the specific discomfort of a man confronting his own error, calculation, and then finally, with a visible effort of will, decision. "Get me CENTCOM," he said. The next 47 minutes were among the most intense of Daniel Acaffer's career. Hale moved with an urgency that acknowledged, in every action, that time lost was a currency he no longer had. He pushed the intelligence package up the chain with his personal endorsement, cutting through the procedural layers that would normally have slowed authorization by hours. There was resistance. There is always resistance at every level to the kind of rapid reorientation that this required. But the specificity of Alina's intelligence, the precision of the coordinates, the exact personnel and vehicle numbers, the 200 timeline, it was the kind of information that silenced the instinct to wait and see. Authorization for air support came through at 22:48 hours. A QRF, Quick Reaction Force, was wheels up from a staging base 40 minutes away at 23:01. Back inside the canyon, Alina was still alive, but the situation had begun to shift. She had observed from her position near the generator a change in the camp's atmosphere that her instincts read immediately as dangerous. Hassani's security lieutenant, a lean, watchful man the camp's personnel called Malik, had begun moving through the eastern section of the camp with 2 armed escorts, checking faces, asking questions. Something had triggered his suspicion. Not Alina specifically, not yet, but the net was tightening. She needed to make one more move before it closed. She had identified 2 external communication antenna cables during her earlier reconnaissance. If she could disable them, Hassani's forces would lose the ability to call for reinforcement from affiliated cells in the surrounding area once the U.S. strike began. It would contain the engagement. It would protect the QRF. It would also require her to move from her current position into a part of the camp with significantly higher exposure. She looked at the antenna. She looked at Malik moving through the tents 60 meters away. She made the calculation in about 4 seconds. Then she moved. The first antenna cable was easy. Too easy, perhaps, the kind of ease that in Alina's experience was not a gift but a warning. She reached it during a gap in the patrol rotation, cut it cleanly with her knife at a point low enough to the ground that the damage would not be immediately visible, and was back in shadow before the next guard completed his turn. 12 seconds. Clean. Controlled. The second antenna was 40 meters further into the camp, closer to the command tent, in territory where the density of armed personnel made every step a calculated risk. Alina moved toward it the way she moved through everything in this camp, with the appearance of belonging, of purposefulness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. It was not acting. It was precision. There is a difference. She was 8 meters from the second antenna when Malik's voice cut through the camp noise. It wasn't directed at her. Not at first. He was shouting at a guard about a discrepancy in the tent roster. One of the conscripted workers in the eastern section had given answers that didn't align when cross-checked. In the sharp, methodical way of someone who had spent years hunting infiltrators, Malik had pulled on a thread and found it loose. Alina cut the second antenna cable. She was already turning away when Malik's second-in-command stepped from behind a vehicle 10 meters to her left and looked directly at her face. There was a half-second where the world balanced on a point. Elena saw the recognition forming in the man's eyes, not recognition of who she was, but recognition of what she wasn't. The fraction of misalignment in her posture, her clothing, her bearing that told a trained eye, this one doesn't belong. He opened his mouth. Elena moved before the sound came out. What followed was not cinematic. Real combat never is. It was fast, brutal, and conducted in near silence for the first 30 seconds as Elena fought with the controlled desperation of someone who understood that the moment sound escalated, everything changed. She put the second-in-command down without killing him, a decision made in a fraction of a second that she would reflect on later with something approaching surprise at her own restraint. Then she ran. The camp erupted behind her. Gunshots, shouting, the harsh carrying sound of Malik's voice issuing orders in rapid Arabic, flashlight beams cutting through the dark between tents. Elena ran through the eastern section, the one geography she knew best, moving toward the conscript tent cluster toward Amara. A bullet cracked past her close but no impact. She went low, changed direction, used a parked vehicle for cover, came up on the other side and kept running. Amara was standing at the entrance to her tent when Elena arrived. She was already holding a small bag. She had heard the commotion and understood immediately what it meant. She had been ready for this moment for months, maybe, Elena thought. She had been ready for a moment like this her entire adult life. Now, Elena said in Arabic. Now, Amara confirmed, and they ran together. The eastern wall of the canyon had one weakness, a section where erosion over decades had created a natural ramp of broken rock, steep and treacherous but climbable, that Amara had identified during her months in the camp, and had, in her precise and careful way, memorized as an exit. She led Elena to it without hesitation, and they climbed in the dark with weapons fire beginning to intensify behind them, Malik's forces spreading through the camp in a search pattern that had not yet, not quite, reached the correct vector. They were halfway up the rock face when the bullet found Elena. It was a graze, the exterior edge of a round that struck the canyon wall beside her and shed enough velocity to carry a fragment across the outside of her left shoulder rather than into it. The impact was sharp and immediate, and the blood came quickly, soaking through her abaya. She registered the pain with the part of her brain assigned to it and set it aside. She kept climbing. Her left arm was weaker but functional. She kept climbing. At the top of the canyon wall, breathing hard, blood seeping into her sleeve, Elena turned and looked back down at the camp. In the chaos below, she saw it, the vehicle staging area, where the 11 convoy trucks were now beginning to move. Engines starting, headlights coming on. Hassani was accelerating the timeline. The commotion had told him that his operation was compromised, and his response was not to stop, but to go faster, to get the convoy out before whatever had reached his camp could stop it. Elena made the calculation. The QRF was en route, but based on her timing estimate, they were at least 60 to 70 minutes out. The convoy at its current rate of preparation would be mobile in 20 minutes. The math was not good. She had concealed in her pack, retrieved from the rock crevice on her way up the canyon wall, 2 blocks of demolition explosives she had carried from the fob on a calculation exactly like this one. Standard military demolition material, not enough to destroy the convoy, but enough to destroy the road. The single access road into and out of the canyon was a narrow cut through a rocky hillside, 200 meters north of the camp entrance. 1 vehicle wide, no bypass. If that road was gone, the convoy was trapped. Elena looked at Amara. Can you get to the coordinates I gave you, alone? Amara looked back at her with an expression that was not fear and not bravado, but something more durable than either. The look of a person who has already survived things they were not supposed to survive and has made a private peace with difficulty. I already know the way, she said. Elena nodded. She handed Amara the radio. "If I'm not at those coordinates in 90 minutes, transmit on this frequency. Tell them everything you told me. They'll come for you." Amara took the radio. Their hands held for a moment, a grip that communicated in half a second what would have taken an hour to say out loud. Then Amara moved north along the ridgeline, and Alina turned south, toward the canyon entrance, toward the road, with 2 blocks of explosive and a shoulder that was bleeding steadily into the dark. She had approximately 15 minutes. She started running at night across broken terrain with a bleeding shoulder, and the sound of a mobilizing convoy behind you clarifies the mind in a way that nothing else can. There is no space for anything except the next step, the next decision, the next breath. Alina Vasquez had been in difficult situations before. She had been shot at, had been cornered, had operated in environments where the margin of survival was measured in seconds and centimeters. But this was different. This was all of those situations simultaneously, compressed into a single corridor of action with no retreat and no certainty at the end of it. She reached the access road in 11 minutes. The canyon's single exit point was exactly as her reconnaissance had shown it, a narrow cut through the hillside, rock walls rising on both sides, the road surface barely wide enough for a military truck to navigate without scraping its flanks. 50 meters into the cut, there was a point where the rock overhang narrowed further, a natural compression point. If the road was going to be blocked, it needed to happen there. Alina placed the first demolition block at the base of the right wall, at the narrowest point of the overhang, using the rock formation to direct the blast inward and upward rather than simply outward. This was not an assassination charge. She wasn't trying to kill anyone. She was trying to drop enough rock across the road's surface to make it impassable. She placed the second block 20 meters behind the first, in the cleft between the road surface and the left wall, oriented to collapse the wall's base. The timer fuses she set gave her 90 seconds. She ran back out of the cut, threw herself behind a rock outcrop, covered her head and counted. The twin explosions came at second 87. Not the sharp crack of ordnance in open air, but something deeper, more geological, the sound of rock deciding to move, a rumbling concussion that she felt in her chest and her teeth and the ground beneath her. The canyon walls redirected the blast upward in a column of dust and displaced stone. She heard the secondary collapse, the overhang coming down, rock upon rock, filling the road cut with a barrier that no wheeled vehicle was going to cross in the next several hours. She pressed her back against her rock and listened to the dust settle. From inside the canyon she could hear the convoy sounds change. The engines that had been revving toward departure were now idling, then stopping. Voices, the specific sound of organized frustration. Hassani's forces were at the vehicles, and the vehicles had nowhere to go. Alina allowed herself 4 seconds of something that was not quite relief, more like the physical sensation of a held breath finally releasing. And then she was moving again. North along the ridgeline, following Amara's path, one hand pressed against the wound on her shoulder, the blood warm and sticky between her fingers, keeping her pace as even as she could make it. She was trying to calculate the QRF timeline when her radio, Amara, had the primary encrypted set, but Alina had kept a secondary emergency unit in her pack, received an incoming signal. Daniel's voice, broken by static but unmistakably Daniel, controlled and clear through the interference. "Eagle, this is Kestrel. QRF is 22 minutes out. Air support standing by. Give me your position." Alina exhaled. She pressed the transmit key. "Kestrel, this is Eagle. Road cut is down. Convoy is contained. I am mobile on the north ridgeline, approximately 2 clicks from extraction coordinates. I have a passenger." She paused. "And Kestrel, tell Hale the data was right." "Copy that, Eagle." A pause. "He knows." She moved north. The next 18 minutes were the most physically demanding of Alina Vasquez's life. The ridgeline terrain was uneven and treacherous in the dark. Her shoulder was losing blood at a rate that was concerning without yet being critical, and the sounds from the canyon below her, indicated that Hassani's forces were beginning to work around the blocked road on foot, armed men climbing the canyon walls, searching the ridgeline. They were not yet close, but they were coming. She found Amara at the extraction coordinates, a flat, rock-clear area large enough for a helicopter at the plateau's edge, just where Alina had marked it on her mental map. Amara was crouched behind a boulder, Alina's radio in hand, eyes scanning the darkness in every direction with the vigilance of someone who had survived this long on attention alone. She saw Alina and stood. She saw the wound. Her expression tightened. "I'm fine," Alina said, which was not entirely true but was true enough. "The helicopter?" Amara asked. 18 minutes, maybe less now." They crouched together behind the boulder and waited, listening to the sounds of Hassani's forces moving on the slopes below. The canyon from this elevation was visible in its entirety, and what they could see now was the beginning of something else. On the southern horizon, moving fast and low, the navigation lights of U.S. aircraft, the QRF helicopters, and behind them the higher, faster shapes of close air support. Inside the canyon, someone must have seen the lights too, because the sounds below changed again, and then, from the camp, there was the first sound of coordinated ground fire, and then the first sound of U.S. ordnance responding. Alina watched from the ridgeline as the camp below became the subject of a very precise and very total military response. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt something quieter and harder to name, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent everything they had to make a necessary thing happen. Then she heard the helicopter. She pulled a signal mirror from her kit and angled it into the aircraft's floodlight 3 times. The helicopter banked, turned, descended. The rotor wash hit them like a physical force, kicking up dust and small stones. And then, in the noise and the wind and the light, Alina saw movement below the plateau edge. A figure climbing, fast, purposeful, heading directly toward the extraction point. She recognized the way he moved even before she saw his face. Tariq Hassani. Not fleeing, not hiding, coming toward the helicopter, toward her. Whether he understood fully what the extraction was or was simply moving toward the nearest exit from the chaos below, he was coming and he was armed and he was 20 meters away. Alina stepped out from behind the boulder. She had her sidearm raised. Hassani stopped. For 4 seconds they looked at each other across the dark plateau, the woman who had dismantled his operation piece by piece from the inside, and the man who had ordered the deaths of hundreds of civilians with the bureaucratic calm of someone signing documents. He moved his weapon. She fired twice, both shots to the legs, controlled, deliberate. He went down, he did not die. That was the choice she made. She crossed to him in 3 steps, removed his weapon, zip-tied his wrists with practiced efficiency, and looked back at Amara, who was standing at the helicopter's open door with the crew chief's hand on her arm. "Ready," the crew chief shouted over the rotors. Alina looked at Hassani on the ground, at Amara in the door, at the canyon below where U.S. forces were completing what she had started, at the dark sky above Tal Safra where 412 people were asleep, safe and unaware. "Ready," she said. The medical team at Fob Kestrel cleaned and closed Alina's shoulder wound in 31 minutes. It required 14 stitches. The medic, a young specialist named Tors who had joined the unit 8 months ago and had heard Alina's name spoken with something approaching mythology, worked in silence because the look on her face made it clear that conversation was not what she needed. She sat on the medical bay table in a paper gown, staring at the opposite wall while Tors worked. Not vacant, Alina Vasquez was never vacant, but deeply, internally present with something that had no external form. The events of the last 36 hours were already reorganizing themselves inside her into the particular shape that experience takes when it becomes memory, when the urgency drains away, and what's left is the weight of what actually happened. Amara was in a separate medical bay being evaluated and processed. She was physically unharmed. The psychological evaluation, the Army's interpreter told Elena gently, would take longer to assess. Elena understood. She had requested to speak with Amara before any official debrief began, and that request had been granted. A small concession from a command structure that was, in the hours since the operation's conclusion, recalibrating its relationship to Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez somewhat dramatically. Tariq Hassani, the commander, was in military custody, transported under secure escort to a holding facility where intelligence personnel would begin the long, careful work of extracting everything he knew about his network, his financing, his affiliated cells, and his future plans. He would face a military tribunal. The charges against him, when formally compiled, would constitute one of the most comprehensive indictments of wartime atrocity the region had seen in years. He would not become a martyr, he would become a case number. Elena had made sure of that when she chose her aim on the plateau. Colonel Marcus Hale came to the medical bay at 600. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, a hesitation that Elena noticed and filed away. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, not in a broken way, in the way of a person who has recently understood something about themselves that they hadn't understood before, and is still deciding what to do with the knowledge. He sat down in the chair beside the medical bay table. He didn't speak immediately. "The village is safe," he said finally. "I know," she said. The QRF confirmed. Convoy was fully contained. No one in Tal Safra was harmed. She nodded. Hale was quiet for another moment. Then, "You disobeyed a direct command. You left the base without authorization. You conducted an unsanctioned solo operation inside hostile territory." He paused. "I am required to report this to the JAG office. There will be a formal review." "I understand," Elena said. "I will also be submitting a full account of my role in delaying the initial response to your intelligence assessment." He said it evenly, without drama, the way a man says something he has already made peace with. "Whatever consequences follow from that, I'll accept them." Elena looked at him directly for the first time since he'd entered the room. "Thank you, sir," she said. He nodded once, stood, and left. The formal review convened 3 weeks later. Elena appeared before it without legal representation by choice. She answered every question with complete honesty about her decision to leave the base, about her reasoning, about the information she had and the options she had assessed and the calculations she had made. She did not apologize. She did not perform remorse she did not feel. The reviewing panel deliberated for 6 hours. At the end of it, the charges were quietly closed without action. No formal entry was made in Elena's service record. The official documentation described the Tal Safra operation as a coordinated intelligence and interdiction success. The name of the individual primarily responsible for its outcome appeared, but without emphasis. Daniel Akafer was commended for his role in transmitting the intelligence package and securing rapid authorization for the QRF deployment. He accepted the commendation at a small ceremony in the base's briefing room, surrounded by the unit. He shook hands with Colonel Hale and made a speech of exactly 3 sentences, which was 3 sentences more than he had wanted to give. Afterward, he found Elena in the analysis room. "You could have gotten killed," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "You're going to do it again, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. Elena looked at the corkboard, which already had new photographs on it, new red string, the beginning of a new pattern emerging from the data. She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. Amara Khalil was formally processed through military and diplomatic channels over the following 6 weeks. Her case was handled with unusual speed and care, partly because the intelligence she had provided was valued at a level that generated institutional gratitude, and partly because Elena submitted a personal written statement on her behalf that was, by every account of those who read it, among the most precisely argued and morally serious documents the reviewing committee had received in years. Amara was granted protected status. For months later, she was resettled in a Western country, in a modest apartment in a mid-sized city where she began, carefully, quietly, the work of building a new life. She sent Alina one message, through a secure channel after she arrived. 3 words in Arabic, the door opened. Alina read it in the analysis room, late at night, alone. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she saved the message, closed the channel, and returned to the files open on her screens. The Distinguished Service Cross arrived 6 weeks after the operation. It came in a small box, without ceremony, the Army's way of honoring things that couldn't be fully discussed publicly. A captain from the commendation's office delivered it personally and offered a handshake that Alina returned with genuine warmth. The captain left. Alina opened the box, looked at the medal for a moment, then placed it in her locker, on the shelf behind her spare uniform. She did not tell anyone. 3 days later, she submitted a request for reassignment to a new forward position. The request was approved within 48 hours, faster, she was told, than any reassignment request in the unit's recent history. She suspected Colonel Hale had made a call. On the morning of her departure, she stood in the pre-dawn dark outside Fob Kestrel for a moment before boarding the transport vehicle. The desert wind was moving, carrying sand and the smell of distance. She thought about Tal Safra not dramatically, not with the weight of someone processing their own heroism, but simply and clearly, the way you think about a thing that happened and cannot unhappen. 412 people had woken up that morning, and the morning after that. And the morning after that. They would never know her name. That was fine. That was exactly fine. She got in the vehicle. The transport plane took off at 4:40 hours, lifting into a sky that was just beginning, at its eastern edge, to consider the color of morning. Alina sat beside a window and watched the desert fall away below. In her lap was a new file, new photographs, new coordinates, a new set of patterns beginning to resolve themselves through the data into something she could almost already see. She opened the file. She started reading. And